Thalmin. The moon was a great many things to many different people. To the old believers, it was the metaphysical embodiment of the ancestral plane, caught in an internal battle between light and dark. To the Nexus, it was an adjacent realm's sole connection to the Primorvale, an umbilical through which matter and manner alike were drip-fed in an eternal cycle of death and rebirth. Whilst many bickered and argued over the minor and insignificant details of its nature, no one, not a single soul, had ever made the claim that it was in any way, shape or form another realm. A realm for departed ancestors in the metaphysical context? Yes. But a tangible realm of rock and stone? No. Such ramblings belong to the crazed sermons of the village idiot, or the town fool, substantiated only by the many revelations one could find at the bottom of a tankard of ale. And yet, here I was, a prince, of sound mind and steady mettle, actively considering the same ramblings, but with the pensiveness one would have to an oracle's preachings. Yes, Emma replied confidently, and with not an ounce of hesitation. Or at least in my reality it is. I'm not too sure about the Nexus. But here? Not only is the moon an entirely distant realm, but every point in the night sky could also be considered a realm unto its own. I did not know what to feel following that revelation. I didn't even know how to take that statement, which in any other situation would have simply been a confirmation of one's fractured mental state. Questions abounded, alongside feelings, all of which tore at what I knew, or what I thought I knew. My mind bounded to fill the gaps of this new paradigm. One that I knew was impossible, but that I rationalized as possible. Not only out of Emma's impossible proofs, but likewise out of Eleanor's rationale. Earthrealm was a dead realm. And this meant that anything was possible, given nothing was known of such a fundamentally broken place, of such a fundamentally eerie and empty space. My curiosity reached for questions I didn't even have words for. However, my focus eventually landed on a simple, tangible demand. One which I directed towards the reality-defined entity I called a friend. Show me then, I announced tersely. Show me this realm, which floats amidst dead space, and show us the journey through which you established once and for all that the moon is in fact a realm. This ultimatum, which I assumed to be well received beneath the Earthrealmer's faceplate, likewise brought about an expression that I'd rarely seen on the princess thus far. A look of restrained, yet visible excitement. This stood in stark contrast to the Venerian, who slunk further and further into abject dread. I knew not which camp to fall under. For even in my most optimistic of projections did I find myself uneasy at the prospects of a prophecy made true, of the existence of a power that could truly attain the same heights as the Nexus. Even if that power was as benevolent as Emma was intent on portraying. The journey, huh? Emma spoke under a lackadaisical tone of voice. That's actually a great idea, she continued, turning towards me with a slight skip in her step. An action completely contrary to the enigmatic world she belonged to. The scene expectedly shifted once more. Away from the chrome ball and its incessant beeping. Away from the gut-churning nothingness of the void beyond the non-existent tapestry. Far beneath the blue skies and once more on solid earth. More than that, we were once more thrust back towards the vast expansive steppes in which this launch site was situated. One which seemed to be busier than it was in the previous firespear launch, with phantom humans donning grey and green uniforms bearing the sigil of peasants, interspersed between more humans carrying boxy equipment, all aimed towards this new idol of their devotion. Gone was the squat form of the previous firespear. In its place was a taller, much more imposing monolith, one which finally lived up to its moniker of Tower. Though similar to its predecessor, it remained precariously shackled to the earth, with 4 arms of heavy steel and a tower of metal scaffolding seemingly bracing it from ascending prematurely. Every mission you've seen up to this point in time has been unmanned, Emma began confidently, before sheepishly correcting herself with a quick aside. With the exception of Wan Hu, none have since attempted to reach the stars atop of these oversized spears, she continued, as she gestured towards a procession of vehicles and a stream of humans who promptly entered a mannerless ascender. But all that changes today, as on this day, barely 58 years since we first took to the skies, do we now aim to shoot beyond it, to prove once and for all that man can and will pierce the heavens, to boldly go, in spite of the dangers, in spite of the risks, and even in spite of our destination's inhospitality to all earthly life. Emma paused abruptly, her voice stuttering in a rare moment of inexplicable thought, or to see what lies beyond the next horizon. Immediately following this, did several figures emerge from the ascender, all crowding around an oddly dressed human in a baggy and ill-fitting bright orange bodysuit. Because there will always be those amidst our ranks ready to put it all on the line, those who would dare to push the boundaries, to answer the call of that most captivating of human callings, the need for exploration, to be, and spirits forbid, to die a pioneer. Foolishness! I could hear my uncle responding, his voice echoing throughout the proving dens, loud enough to pierce through the rumbling of otherworldly machines and the sharp clanking of metal as the orange-suited human entered what looked to be a coffin. Brazenness for brazenness' sakes, all for selfish ends. Selflessness and sacrifice with only the vaguest of callings is a waste to both clan and kin. A death should serve a tangible gain, not a vague ideal or ephemeral calling. But when brazenness is shared amongst an entire people, to the point where all are willing to share in the cost and effort of fulfilling such a foolish notion, is it at that point madness or brilliance? I muttered to myself under a hushed breath, my focus fixated on the calmness of it all. In spite of knowing that what might come next could spell disaster. Thasia. 58 years. Barely a generation following their tentative grasp of flight. And here they were, seemingly unsatisfied with what should have been the greatest achievement of a landed flock. I thought to myself, as ceremonies and pleasantries abounded before the suited human was promptly sealed within his metal coffin. A cramped space that looked more akin to a torture chamber than a vehicle. The scene quickly shifted as we followed the descent of the remaining humans back towards the gathered crowd, and were once again treated to the sight of the firespear to its fullest extent. However, unlike every other firespear launch thus far, there existed a gnawing, uncomfortable feeling welling up within me, a feeling which only intensified as I watched this tower standing idly in a thick swirling fog of its own breath. A discomfort, born of the knowledge that unlike all prior launches, that this was no longer an oversized toy, but a vehicle. As the top of it wasn't a strange chrome ball, nor a memory shard, or even nothing at all. No. Atop of it now, nearly 20 stories above the ground, was a sapient being. A person, who was knowingly putting himself atop of a tower of fire and flame, or with the faintest of hopes of surviving a journey into an equally unwelcoming and hostile void. Sanity no longer applied, I thought to myself. For how could someone sane risk assured death? And then it clicked. My eyes shifted sharply towards the prideful Earthrealmer, who stood there explaining every excruciating detail behind this event. A narrative quickly formed, as prior conversations now locked into place, and a renewed understanding of both Emma and her people manifested within my mind. You could say we have a habit of making ourselves welcome in the most inhospitable of places, as just like those that have come before me, I now find myself exploring a reality that isn't just inhospitable, but actively hostile to my very being. I didn't have to look any further to see this very brazenness in action. As every waking second of Emma's life was in and of itself a testament to this same propensity for risk-taking, taken to its ludicrous extreme. And yet, she manages to persist, in spite of the knowledge, the understanding, that one small misstep could mean assured death. My mind raced, recalling stories of Avenor harbouring similar dispositions. Stories of great explorers and intrepid pioneers, each risking wing and talon to explore the expanse of our globe. Stories whose themes felt so distant and ephemeral, incompatible within a post-Nexian Reformation world, even if it was once our history. But here, that spirit felt alive. That sentiment felt vicariously through a completely foreign people. Not only in the sightseer that was rapidly approaching its climax, but also through the entity presenting it, who I had taken a kinship to. His name was then Senior Lieutenant Yuri Gagarin. The Earthrealmer's voice finally came through amidst my own thoughts that seemed louder than they ever had been. And on this day, did he fulfill the hopes of dreamers and pioneers stretching back millennia. Whoosh! Came the cacophonous rumbling of the firespear's flame as massive streams of fire erupted from beneath the tower, bathing the plinth and the empty space beneath it in the raw and unbridled fury of a dragon's scornful wrath. So loud was the continuous thrum of explosions that the release of its four massive anchors barely registered. Slowly did the tower rise, ascending against all known conventions, defying Laypole with the fury of a dauntless people. A people who, by all conventional wisdom, shouldn't have ever attained speeds beyond that of a tame beast of burden. And yet, here they were, riding atop of the power of tamed explosions. The scene shifted once more, now split into three. To our left was the compound, and the humans who now looked onwards towards the skies. To our middle was the trailing perspective of the craft itself, triggering notes of exhilaration and nausea in equal measures. And finally, to our right, was a sight from within the coffin itself, showing a man seemingly helpless atop of a tomb of his kin's own making. I watched on with inextricable focus, my eyes monitoring the man's movements under the strains that would naturally come from such immense speeds. What speeds must he tolerate to breach the skies, Emma? I finally inquired, watching on as the skies began to inexplicably thin. Just under 5 miles, Emma paused, as if purposefully teasing. Per second? It took me a moment to register that in relative terms I could visibly conceive of. But once I did, I was once more left dumbfounded. The same could be said for Thalman and Eleanor, as silence dominated most of the journey up, with the firespear going through the same motions as its predecessor, segmenting and separating, until all that was left was an odd-looking spheroid object sat atop of a brown cylinder I'd hazard to even call an enclosure, let alone a vehicle. It was at this point, however, did the rightmost image come to dominate our view. As we looked on, from the perspective of the cramped and unseemly cockpit, towards a porthole that displayed not just endless skies or clouds, but the skies as seen from the perspective of an old god. The skies as seen from above, not within, and certainly not below, but above. The former sightseers had been clearer about this. But to see it from the perspective of a human, a mannerless being with little individual capacity other than a thinking mind and 2 dexterous hands, was beyond breathtaking. This undertaking wouldn't have been possible without everyone back home too. Emma interrupted abruptly, displaying once more the rows upon rows of conservatively dressed, featureless phantoms, crowding behind machines of blinking lights and tables with paper strewn about. And not just the thinkers, but the builders, and everyone else responsible for actually constructing everything it took to reach this point, she continued, quickly showing signs familiar to me from our very first night together. Metal foundries and immense forges of impossible size and scale. At least, impossible for a new realmer.
Alone you may not be capable of much,
Thalmin began, taking all of us by surprise.
A sole human seems to only be capable of lofty ambitions and, admittedly, persuasive words. But it takes a village, a town, a city, and an entire kingdom to achieve those dreams.
Well said, Thalmin. Moreover, it's another thing entirely as well, to mobilize the political will and economic capital to achieve said ends, Emma acknowledged, as we watched as the craft continued on its lonely voyage through nothing. A few more moments of silence passed before the craft began firing its engines to seemingly no effect, though its ineffectualness was misleading, as it indeed began its descent, re-entering the skies where it attempted to shear apart its lower cylindrical segment, only to find itself tethered by a flimsy set of umbilicals that Emma explained as unplanned but thankfully self-resolving. The umbilicals eventually tore apart, leaving only its chrome orb to descend further, before a sharp explosion marked the expulsion of none other than its occupant, the man now floating precariously back down to the surface with the aid of a parachute attached to his seat. Following which, moments after his landing, did he approach 2 more humans before Thalmin followed up with a question I hadn't anticipated.
Emma?
Yes, Thalmin?
I'm assuming, from what we saw beyond the skies, that the man didn't just enter the void, only to return like a stone thrown straight upwards.
Nope. He actually orbited the globe, circling it from above, once, Emma announced with glee.
And your world, it is not small, is it?
It's just under 25,000 miles in circumference, but I'm not sure how that stacks to most realms.
Puny for the Nexus.
Eleanor finally re-entered the conversation. But average for an adjacent realm, I countered.
And how long did it take for this man to circumnavigate your globe from beyond the skies?
Thalmin pressed onwards, unbothered by either of our responses. 108 minutes, Emma responded gleefully once more. Though, strangely, the Lupinor didn't seem to share in this same joyous and boisterous of attitudes.
Thalmin. 1 hour and 48 minutes? 5 miles per second. I didn't need the scholarly acumen of my sisters to understand the implications of such numbers. For the practical, and most importantly the martial implications, behind such capabilities weren't just impressive. It was frightening. To be able to ascend into the void, only to drop right back down from the skies, was a crude but horrifying mirror to the Nexus's instantaneous teleportation. My mind was now filled to the brim with the sheer number of possibilities brought about by such a novel vehicle. From the deployment of whole battalions, all dropping from the skies, to the delivery of weapons. Weapons similar in destructive potential to the explosive power of Emma's crate. Weapons, perhaps even more powerful than that. Just under 2 hours, for a kingdom to be able to strike anywhere on a planet with impunity. Barely a town crier's second gallop. for a ruler to deploy his forces, his armies, his soldiers, and his weapons of destruction, to rain hellfire if need be. And this was merely 58 years following their first flight into the skies. Eleanor. And I assume your initial successes led to even greater and greater accomplishments without one inkling of failure? I countered, observing, analyzing, digging into every available crack and crevice in this rose-tinted look into the Earthrealmer's past.
Not at all, Eleanor, the suited figure admitted. If anything, close calls were more common than clean missions, and more than that, I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the lives lost over our race for the stars.
What appeared to be a list of names manifested in front of us, alongside sightseers of firespears either exploding upon their plinths or breaking apart in mid-air. The sights of which put the warehouse explosion to shame, giving even the usually stoic Thalmin pause for thought. Throughout the scrolling of names, Emma stood still, announcing out of some respect for her ancestors a moment of silence.
This is the least I can do to honor their sacrifices. To never forget the human cost of progress,
was her reasoning, which could have just as easily been misconstrued as some misguided form of reverence.
We don't claim to be perfect, Eleanor. If anything, I've shown you just how many setbacks and tragedies we did have prior to this point. And while the causes of these tragic losses ranged from inexplicable malfunctions to gross negligence of those in charge, to even design flaws and oversights, we continue to press onwards. Some of us learned from our mistakes, and some of us not so much. But in any case, I believe we should move forwards towards our original question, starting first with the fulfillment of Thalmin's request.
Thalmin. Just as quickly as my concerns over Emma's people were reaching its precipice, was I placated by an unexpected source, her honourable decision to respect her ancestors' sacrifices through action. An action which may not entirely define her leaders, but demonstrated at the very least a strong sense of moral character in the candidate they chose to represent them. Following which, we were once again thrust into another locale. However, unlike the vast steppes of the prior location, were we instead brought to a tropical idyllic beach, with lush and verdant greenery, interspersed between commanding and imposing buildings. Gone was the hammer and sickle that dominated much of the prior location's structures and people. Instead, it was replaced by two banners. One bearing some strange house sigil on a blue orb, with two sloppily drawn squiggles interrupting its interior, complete with 4 foreign letters that more than likely belonged to some upstart house, too insecure to rely on symbology alone to represent their clan. Next was a far more novel but simple banner, consisting of a series of red and white stripes, complete with a canton of some 50 or so stars at its upper left-hand corner. Together, I liken this to be some writ between house and kingdom, some industrious endeavour. Regardless, I watched as Emma positioned us by the single largest building within this compound. A towering monolith in and of itself, with doors that seemed better suited for the mythical giants of old, rather than any living mortal. These doors, slowly and with great effort, opened up to reveal a massive room with an interior dominated by a complicated mess of metal pipes and bracings, with hundreds of phantom humans sporting overalls and white coats, all crowding around elevated platforms behind what was first shown to us at the beginning of the Museum of Firespears. One of the single most tallest and elegant-looking firespears of all. One that stretched higher up than the tallest building in Havenbrock. One that could easily rival the inter-ring steeples within the Isle of Towers, and perhaps even the outer ring of the Nexus's Crownlands. What Emma would promptly refer to as the Saturn V rocket, she beamed proudly. This immense monolith slowly began its crawl towards its plinth,
atop of a tracked vehicle that moves slower than Prince Taunin's laziest crawls. The sightseer took this opportunity to position us close by, as Emma began gesturing at the behemoth that we strained upwards to look at. The most powerful rocket of its century, with a thrust capacity 10 times that of the firespear that took Yuri Gagarin to space. Emma paused, gesturing towards its lower segment, as the sightseer took us towards what looked to be massive conical shafts. Powered by 5 massive F1 engines, each individually larger than the V2s I showed earlier. I stared blankly, my eyes attempting to bring about some rhyme and reason to the magnitude of these engines. More than that, Emma was quick to provide a cutaway of the interior of the first section of the tower, revealing that within it wasn't cargo or passengers, but once again, fuel. Combustible liquid stored as high up as a 12-story building, fueling engines the size of a rural commoner's hut. I didn't speak. Not even as Emma went further up the stack, towards the second section of the massive tower, with fuel and engines only marginally smaller than the first section. A 7-story height, fueling carriage-sized engines. The ludicrousness of this entire display was too much to bear. But that was when the tone of the sightseer took an unexpected turn. As we were taken away from the verdant grasses and idyllic beaches of this compound, and instead thrust towards a manufactorium. The sightseer physically moving to cross the distances involved this time around, as if to emphasize the sheer scale of this undertaking. This wasn't just the work of a single individual, or even a group of individuals, Emma began, as we moved, manufactorium to manufactorium, each assembling either unrecognizable parts or the staple features of the monolith we'd just witnessed. This was an undertaking that took a nation to build. With experts from countless industries, and cooperation between rival companies, all in order to build the behemoth that was the Saturn V, plate by plate and bolt by bolt. We crisscrossed what appeared to be an expansive continent, crossing through grassy steppes, snowy mountains, great canyons, and through rivers and settlements of all shapes and sizes, visiting not only manufactoriums now, but scholarly offices, Nexian-sized forges, and places I couldn't even put into words. All of this across paved roads and rail spanning a continent. We eventually found ourselves back at the beachside compound, now positioned amidst a crowd gathered a fair distance away from the firespear itself. The crowds, similar to Gagarin's launch into the void, carried with them boxes and tools of all sorts, all pointed towards the firespear. 1 million eyes were trained on the launch site that day, and tens of millions more through the memory shards delivering live images of the launch to people from around the globe, Emma began, as picture upon picture emerged across the sightseer. I'm showing you a live feed of everything happening concurrently that day, from the 3 astronauts, Armstrong, Collins, and Aldrin, making their way up to the command module. Emma paused, showing the 3 men in question, in suits of white and rounded glass helmets, as they approached their tomb-like enclosure. To Mission Control and the hundreds of people working around the clock to ensure the complex systems needed for such an endeavor worked as intended. Another picture emerged, displaying a room of row upon row of machines, and the phantom-like humans behind them. To the various technicians, engineers, and support staff all working tirelessly until the very last minute. Tens more images emerged, of hundreds of humans toiling about various inexplicable tasks, all at the service of this cathedral of iron and steel. However, just as all of these concurrent images appeared, did they quickly fade, as the sightseer once more levelled its sights not too far from the plinth, amidst the crowd of onlookers. Following which, did foreign words under a muffled filter begin what I assumed to be a countdown. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 11, 10, 9,
as second after second did my heart beat to the tune of this moment.
Ignition sequence starts.
A moment marked by an explosion that put all others to shame.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engines running.
As flames and furious smoke swept beneath the plinth, only to erupt back up towards the towering behemoth. Fire burned ferociously beneath the tower as smoke continued to rise. For a moment, I feared the worst as the sights and sounds of failed missions flashed across my mind. However, only a second after that thought did the tower begin to rise.
Liftoff! We have liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour, liftoff of Apollo 11.
I watched as 40 stories worth of iron and steel lifted off of its plinth, rising faster and faster, and in such a way that one could easily forget that this object, this craft, wasn't ever supposed to take flight. But fly it did, as it ascended, its engines, its metal, pulsing, as if gasping and breathing. Throughout it all, as the seconds turned into minutes, and as the craft made it through that invisible layer between the skies and the void, Emma remained silent, simply allowing the various muffled and filtered voices of humans long since dead to speak on her behalf. Not a single voice sounded the least bit panicked. Even excitement itself felt difficult to discern, as every single person seemed uncharacteristically calm. Calm, whilst riding atop of a continuous stream of unending flame. Nobody else spoke, or dared interrupt the pioneers as they left the confines of the skies, eschewing tower after towering sections, leaving barely a stump by the time they'd entered the void proper. It was only after the last section remained floating listlessly did Thacia finally speak.
Thacia.
Emma? Yes, Thacia? How large is your moon?
Just under 5,800 miles in circumference, give or take. About a quarter the size of our planet for scale.
My mind ceased, if only for a moment, as the label of the situation once more dawned on me. My suspicions were proven true, whether for better or for worse. And given Emma's lack of a follow-up response, it was clear that she understood exactly what sorts of thoughts had since entered my mind.
What is all this fuss about the size of these hypothetical realms, Princess?
Eleanor interrupted, his voice as terse as it was uneasy.
It's a matter of distance and perspective, Eleanor, I replied simply, garnering a look of confusion from the man. If the moon truly is a realm of such dimensions, for it to be as small as it is in the night sky, implies that the distances involved are nothing short of astronomical.
Yeah, Emma interjected, with a prideful acknowledgement.
Exactly how far away is the moon, Emma?
Thalwyn interrupted, his features stoic, masking the uneasy undercurrents just beneath the surface.
Just under 239,000 miles,
Emma announced plainly, simply and without hesitation.
How long did it take?
Oh, if you're concerned about us staying here for days on end, don't worry. I'm just about to skip to the good stuff, in fact. But if you're wondering about specifics, it took just about 4 days to reach the moon, at a cruising speed of about 4,223 feet per second.
My beak hung agape, as my eyes were transfixed on the vast empty darkness that dominated this space between realms. Whilst other realms were divided by the fabric of reality itself, Earthrealm was removed from its contemporaries by sheer distance. Impossible distances. Yet distances that were once again breached not by solutions that bridged the gap, but by the brute forcing of the most obvious of solutions that should not have been practical. And so it was that in this sea of absolute nothing did this craft, barely the size of a small house, approach its final destination, the moon.
Thalmin. The journey had been accelerated, all for the sake of practicality. However, as I watched the moon grow closer, expanding to encompass my field of vision, was I met with a throat-clenching impasse. This ethereal place shouldn't have existed. This realm of ancestors and mana, of primordic energies and intangible light, shouldn't have been reachable. It shouldn't be tangible. I watched in disbelief as this cumbersome craft of steel made its awkward descent towards the surface of what was once just a dot in the sky. I watched as those flimsy legs made contact with white rock and stone. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. I listened as the voices of humans rang out within an infinite dark, atop of a realm that wasn't theirs. I grappled with the reality of the situation, as best as I could. The reality that I had to remind myself was in fact possible, owing to the existence of a dead realm. More time flew by now, as images from within the cabin showed these pioneers preparing for the ultimate ends of this mission. It showed, following some awkward shuffling in exiting the craft, one of these astronauts donning a thick suit of white, leaving towards a set of ladders built into the side of the craft. I cocked my head for a moment, my eyes landing on Emma's thickly suited form, and that of her ancestor. And in that moment did I realize the amusing connection that came with human exploration, the necessity for protection of an otherwise weak and fragile form, along with the nerves of steel that must have come with such a precarious endeavor. Following which, did my eyes once more focus on her ancestor, as the man awkwardly shuffled down the ladder, his booted feet touching down on a dusty and desolate wasteland that stretched ominously into the void-filled skies. There's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. He spoke in a foreign tongue, his words translated into high Nexian text beneath his person. After which, did Emma finally speak.
1969. 66 years after we first took to the skies, and 8 years after we first breached it. The year we achieved the impossible. The year we first set foot upon a celestial body. A realm unto its own,
Thacia spoke, her voice restraining the shock welling within. A realm? Of what exactly? Eleanor piped up abruptly. Of rock and dust? Of white-sanded deserts? Perhaps later you will come to find a lush paradise, perhaps an oasis, perhaps something that is befitting of this location's namesake. What was it? The Sea of Tranquility?
Well, no, Eleanor. This is more or less all you're going to get from the moon,
Emma explained, gesturing around her, as her ancestors began fiddling with their mannerless tools. So this was an exercise in futility, then? Expending your resources for the sake of reaching a barren wasteland? Eleanor shot back, before lifting up a finger. You know, Earthrealmer, this is why the Nexus actually identifies pleasant and palatable worlds before exploring them, at least when we aren't too busy exploring our own infinitely expanding plane. But, given the limiting nature of your interrealm travel, it seems like you lack that luxury. He began snickering, garnering a frustrated sigh from Emma, who quickly brought up another picture, set against the darkness of the sightseer.
I can see where you're coming from, Eleanor. I understand that to a Nexian, this endeavor must feel like a waste of resources.
Emma paused, garnering a self-satisfied nod from Eleanor.
But not to us, because where you see endless expanses of nothing, we see a future not beholden to the limitations of today. Because if nature proves not to be forthcoming, then we'll simply build a nature of our own. a nature we can design, control, and adorn to our whims, to our comfort. However, even disregarding all of that, we chose not to go to the moon, not because of a desire to exploit or expand. Instead, we chose to go to it because it was the next logical leap forward.
Emma redirected her gaze towards the floating image of what I assumed to be a human leader standing behind a podium above a crowd of gathered humans. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may as well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? We choose to go to the moon in this decade, and to do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept. One we are unwilling to postpone. And one we intend to win.